We've been working our way through this idea that the gospel is good news, and that it's the good news of the ourselves of God, that God is this relationship of three persons who love each other perfectly, who designed us to be like God and in the image of God, to be in perfect relationships with God and each other. And so as we think about this incredible story of the good news of God, it strikes me as particularly surprising that when we look at our world, it seems like mostly we see bad news. Pick up a newspaper or go through your news feed on your phone. I'm looking at mine on my iPad, and I see just today an article about children and a new disease that's running rampant amongst our kids. I see an article about the ongoing war in Ukraine and the violence and how it continues to escalate. It's a little bit of a slow news day, but I see articles about people killed in California by a grizzly bear, and I see articles about the dysfunction of our political system. My guess is if you're reading the news, you see articles like that today too. But as we go through our news of our world and our nation and our community, so much of it seems bad, doesn't it? And it's not just unique to our world or our nation, it's true in our lives. I think so often we look around and we see a lot of brokenness. We see brokenness in the lives of people that we love, whose relationships are not perfect like God's relationship is perfect, who are dealing with physical disease and brain disease, who are dealing with addiction and broken relationships. And honestly, if we look at ourselves, the person that we know the best, the person for whom we have the most insight, isn't it kind of clear that something's not quite right with us either? It's not just everybody else out there that's full of bad news. There's a lot of bad news that we have to wrestle with too, about who we are, about how we haven't measured up or been the people we thought we should be, or how we have fallen short of the expectations we have for ourselves, much less whatever goals God might have for us. This whole story, this whole recognition of all of that bad news comes back to one fundamental idea that's essential to the Christian understanding of the human situation. That idea is the word sin. We talk about sin a lot in church. It's kind of a theological word, but it's a critical concept, because if we don't get what sin is, we can't get what Jesus did. Let's talk about what sin means. And actually, let's start by talking about what it doesn't mean. Sin isn't just eating a fruit that God told us not to touch. It's not simply breaking the rules when they seem arbitrary or capricious. It's not this idea that there is a cosmic Santa Claus putting people on his naughty list. Fundamentally, sin is this idea that we have rejected God. So we talked last week about this idea that God is a relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and this perfect, loving community, and that God designed us to be part of that relationship. Sin is quite simply saying to God, I don't want to be a part of who you are. I don't want to be part of the family that you designed me to be in the midst of for all eternity. I want to go my own way. We see a number of metaphors in Scripture that help us understand God's concept of sin. One of those is the idea of adultery. Again and again throughout Scripture, we're told that God is like a faithful husband, and we are like an unfaithful wife who runs away and runs off with other men again and again and again, believing that there is some goodness outside of God that we could find, that the relationship that God designed us for just doesn't satisfy. We're told in Scripture that we are like untrustworthy and unruly children who will not respect our parent. In the earliest story of sin in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve take the fruit, it's the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. This idea, quite simply, is that Adam and Eve want to be the ones who determine what is good and what is evil, instead of trusting and letting God make that deliberation. And boy, we've been doing that ever since, haven't we? And we are so certain that we know better than God what would be good for our lives and what would be bad for us. I like the metaphors of adultery or unruly, disobedient children, but the one that is most compelling for me is this idea that sin is a disease. I love this idea that sin is a disease that we all share, that has all kinds of symptoms which manifest in different ways in every one of us. That disease at our core is self-centeredness. And my self-centeredness is exactly opposite of God's character. God, who is by definition three persons who love each other so perfectly that they're in this relationship together. God who is other-centered all the time. God who is most perfectly expressed to us in Jesus Christ, who literally gave his life for his enemies. That God of selflessness is the opposite of who I tend to be most days of my life. I'm a self-centered person. And it manifests in all kinds of ways. I see it every day. Sometimes it manifests in ways that are very socially acceptable. Sometimes it manifests in ways that are not. And we have all kinds of different, I call them symptoms of this disease of self-centeredness. Some people's symptoms are extremely socially unacceptable. Theft, adultery, murder, all fundamentally saying what is good for me is more important to me than what is good for you. But a lot of our socially acceptable sins or sin symptoms are also just manifestations of that self-centeredness. I lie. I lie to get out of getting in trouble because the truth matters less to me than my self-preservation. I gossip. I tell your private stories at a party because I'm more interested in sounding intelligent or impressive or in the know than I am about honoring the trust you placed in me. Again and again and again, we find these incredibly diverse but obvious manifestations of a common disease. I don't honor the Sabbath because I would rather spend my time on myself than spend my time with God. And as we examine all of those manifestations of our sin, there should be two huge ideas that become apparent to us. The first is that our goal is not to cure symptoms. Our goal is not to fix any one of those many and different ways that our self-centeredness manifests, any more than our goal is to cure a fever or cure a runny nose. We want to heal the disease, which means we are not in the business of helping people get a little bit better. We're not in the business of saying, hey, we want alcoholics to become sober people. We want alcoholics to become saved people. And that means that it might be a long journey before their particular symptom is addressed, but we want to get to the root of the disease first. The second thing that's overwhelmingly apparent when we begin to understand what sin really is, as this idea of a disease of self-centeredness, is that we all have it. We all have it. I don't know anybody who isn't, at least on some level, struggling with this disease, which means, hopefully, I can have a little more compassion on those people whose symptoms are less socially acceptable than mine. It means, hopefully, I can look at people who struggle with addiction or who struggle with crime or who have any one of a host of symptoms of their self-centeredness that make me look good in comparison. And I can say, yeah, I know I'm not any different. I know that my disease just manifests differently. And I can look at them and say, hey, I hope for you the same I hope for me, that there could be some way to fix this disease and make us whole again, and make us other-centered, and make us into the image of the God who designed us again. We're not interested in exchanging socially unacceptable symptoms for socially acceptable ones. We don't want to make people who are no longer addicts but are spiritually proud. We want to find some way to be free of this disease. Let's talk a little bit about the effects of our sin. The first and most important effect of sin is that it separates us from God. And when I say it separates us from God, I do not mean that God turns away from us, that God has no interest in us. In fact, the story of Scripture is one of a God who won't give up on us no matter how dire our sin. We see this from the very first pages of Scripture in Genesis chapter 3. After Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God comes looking for them. He doesn't strike them down. He doesn't wipe the slate clean. He doesn't say, I'm done with you, but I'll try again with your kids. God shows up in the garden like he did before to walk with them, and it's Adam and Eve that run from God. We've been running from God ever since. God has sent prophets, and he has sent his Son because God will not be done with us. But sin causes us to run from God. It causes us to hide. It creates a break in the relationship for which we were designed. Sin also breaks our relationship with each other. We see that, again, so obviously in the story in the garden. The first thing that Adam and Eve do after they eat from the fruit of the tree is they realize that they're naked, and they sew fig leaves together and make loincloths for themselves. Have you ever had that dream where you're walking through the halls of school or of work and you're totally naked? It's a terrifying dream. It feels awful. Why? It feels awful because you're exposed, because everybody can see everything about you that you're trying to keep private. But before sin, that wasn't a problem. Before sin, there wasn't a need to hide from each other or to feel shame about who we were. There wasn't a need to worry about how we were perceived because we were not self-centered. We were other-centered. Sin brings in that shame, and it brings in that separation that pulls us from each other. The next thing that happens in the story after God shows up in the garden looking for his children and they hide from him is he begins to ask them questions. And their responses are really telling. Adam says, yeah, I did it, but the woman gave me the fruit. And Eve says, yeah, I gave him the fruit, but the serpent told me to do it. They begin the blame game, and we've been doing that ever since. We have been deflecting the root cause of our sin, saying it's not about me, it's about someone else. It's not my fault, it's someone else's fault. That creates another level of separation, not just from other people or from God, but from ourselves. We begin to deceive ourselves about who we are and what's broken in us and what needs to be repaired. That's why this is such a critical conversation, because if we don't get our diagnosis right, there's never a hope to find the right cure. We have to be made aware of the effects and the depth of our self-centeredness. When that happens, we tend to have a few quick responses. Usually our thought is, well, let's just get more. Maybe more of me is what's needed. Maybe I'll try harder. Maybe I'll get better grades. Maybe I'll put in more hours. Maybe I'll read another self-help book. Maybe I'll learn another skill. Maybe I can be more. Or we say, hey, maybe it's another person that I need to fix my problem. Maybe I need more of this relationship with this woman or man that I've set my heart on. Maybe I need more friends. Maybe I need more likes on Instagram. Maybe I need more people because the one to whom I've made my commitments is no longer satisfying me, and we just look for more of people. Sometimes we say what we need is more of the world. Boy, if I could just get more money or more fame or more power or more success or more alcohol or more time in the casino or more of anything the world offers, maybe that would be enough to solve or at least numb this recognition that something's broken in my life. And the last thing we look for is we look for more religion. We look for more rules. We look for more guidance and advice about how we should live our lives. Boy, if I could just get the right rules to know how to obey or maybe even manipulate God into thinking that I'm better than I am, then perhaps then that would be enough. And the story of Scripture, the story of the gospel, the story of the good news is that none of that is what we need. That it's not about getting more. This isn't a problem that we can solve on our own. This isn't a problem that we can fix because we are the problem. The story of Scripture, the story of the gospel, is that we must come to a recognition that our fundamental problem, this disease that runs throughout all people, including me and including you, has to be solved outside of ourselves. We who are self-centered are not going to come up with a solution for our self-centeredness. So as we go forward in this conversation, next week, we're going to talk about God's solution. We're going to talk about the incredible way that our selfless God brings a cure for our disease. But I need you to sit this week. I need you to sit this week in this uncomfortable place of self-recognition. I need you to sit this week in this uncomfortable place of diagnosis, of saying, hey, what is broken in my life? What is broken in our world? What is broken in our relationships? Because until we come to that full recognition, until we really get the problem, we'll never understand the answer that Christ provides. I know it doesn't sound like good news today, but trust me, the good news is coming. This week I invite you to reflect on this challenge, this common humanity issue, our self-centeredness, our sin, and consider what that looks like in your life and how desperately you want to be made new.